Number 5. Dana breaks Vegas and gets banned. When on the rare occasion that people like you or I go to a casino and win a few hands more than we lose, we leave with maybe a couple $100 more in our pocket than we came in with. But when someone who has as much money as Dana White gets on a heater, the results for the casino can be disastrous. Dana White loves blackjack. He loves blackjack about as much as he loves anything. He once told Barstool Sports that he wanted his family to bury him with a trophy he won from a blackjack tournament against professional players. White is apparently so good at winning big in the game of 21 that he's been barred from several casinos on the Strip, the most prominent being the Palms. Back in 2012, White took the casino for $1.5 million, and when the location sold, the new owners told him they were done with that bullshit. White was not happy with the ban and apparently said the UFC would no longer hold events at the Palms. But another set of owners would come around a few years after the ban and invite Dana back in, because casinos love them some whales. Unfortunately, this backfired on the new management too, and Dana took the casino for nearly $2 million at blackjack for a second time, prompting them to ban him again. But this time, to play up to his ego, the owners gave White a championship belt for his troubles, which he proudly displays in his office to this day. The Fertittas are now the owners of the Palms, so I don't think Dana will be asked to leave anymore. Number 4. Dana versus Japanese gangsters. There has been a lot of speculation over the years that the UFC never really intended to keep Pride alive in Japan after the promotion was acquired back in 2007. But documents from the ongoing UFC antitrust lawsuit show that Pride head Nobuyuki Sakakibara signed a $10 million 7-year non-compete contract. So it would appear that Zuffa very much had the intention of taking over the Japanese market. Of course, that didn't happen, nor did any other Pride events, and the UFC wouldn't return to Japan as a promotion for another 5 years. So what the hell happened? Part of it was the unexpected issues that arose from the initial illegal contracts held by Pride, and another huge factor was the Japanese organized crime syndicate known as the Yakuza. The Japanese mob had their hands in nearly all entertainment in the country, and it was their connections to Pride FC that caused the collapse of the company in the first place. Dana White has never played well with others. He wouldn't even co-promote with M1 to get Fedor, so he damn sure wasn't going to let some gangsters try on his business simply for his own safety. There are stories that Dana was directly threatened by the Yakuza during this transitional period, and that White would have to travel in the country with heavy security. At first, he was defiant, even saying that he would have to be killed to keep him out of Japan. But as we know, Zuffa did let the Japanese market go. He said in many interviews since that the reason things didn't work out is because the Yakuza simply made it too hard to do business in the region. Number 3. The Irish mob pushed Dana out of Boston. From one mafia to another, we've mentioned several times on this list that Dana White returned to Las Vegas as an adult, but the reason he left Boston in the first place was the notorious mobster Whitey Bulger and the Winter Hill Gang. Remember that white-collar boxing exercise business that Dana was doing when he first went back to Las Vegas? Well, he started that in Boston, and business was a booming. Considering he was making good money, the Irish mob, which was prominent in the area, decided to move in on the successful entrepreneur's business with a classic shakedown. One day while teaching class, 2 guys approached White about $2,500 he owed to the Winter Hill Gang. And like a child who pulls the sheets over their head at night, Dana figured if I don't see them, then they're not here. So after the 2 men left, White did absolutely nothing to take care of the bogus debt. Sometime later, he got a phone call letting him know that some associates of the mob boss Whitey Bulger would be there the next day to collect on the cash. Instead of using what money he had to pay off the gangster, White uprooted his entire life and was on a plane to Las Vegas that very day. Dana had already made up his mind that he was going to take over the boxing game, so leaving everything at the drop of a hat to head to the fight capital of the world wasn't as terrifying a transition as it might seem. To keep sleeping with the fishes. Number 2. The Secret Hotel Fight Club. In Dana's late teens and early 20s, while he was still figuring out what he wanted to do with his life, he worked odd jobs like any other young person does. But what Dana organized while he was a bellhop at a Four Seasons in Boston was definitely a sign of things to come. Hotel staff members expect tips if you haven't seen Home Alone 2 before, and as such, disputes over those tips with coworkers can often lead to conflict. Conflict that is best solved with organized violence. White, who saw a need and simply did it, would gather coworkers that had issues with each other in a staff closet and let them beat the shit out of each other until everybody was friends again. Now, this wasn't a Motel 6. This was a high-class establishment, so the rules were simple. Blows only. After all, Guests might complain if the hematoma on your forehead starts to bleed all over their luggage. White continued to oversee the Bellhop Fight Club until one day he just walked out of the building and decided that boxing was going to be the rest of his life. He was wrong, but not too far off, and his early days of fight promotion in a broom closet at the Four Seasons showed that even at a young age, Dana was on the right track. Number 1, Dana versus Tito in midair. The long and storied beef between Tito Ortiz and Dana White has been well documented over the years and is as complex and incomprehensible at times as the Montagues versus the Capulets. At one point, the two were even scheduled to fight in a boxing match to settle their differences, but while that fight fell apart, another fight took place at some point in the early 2000s and was revealed for the first time ever by White in 2017 while appearing on the Conan O'Brien show. Dana, the Fertittas, and Joe Silva were accompanied by the honey-to-be Bad Boy on a flight to Japan that was just taking off. When you're rich and have a private jet, you can apparently do whatever the fuck you want during takeoff, because it was at this point that White said that he and Tito were horsing around. Once Ortiz got White in a neck crank, though, shit got real fast. White began to tap, but Ortiz pulled a full Paul Harris and refused to let go of the hold. Dana started throwing shots to Tito's ribs, and when both men got to their feet, a fist fight ensued that, according to Dana, was shaking the small plane back and forth. Nothing like dying and killing the most important people in the MMA business because of a neck crank. Eventually, the Fertittas stepped in and separated the two, forcing them to sit on opposite sides of the plane for the remainder of the trip. Ortiz called the incident fun in a follow-up interview that MMA Junkie did after White revealed the story. I'm not sure if that means it wasn't as violent as White claimed, but this wouldn't be the first time that Dana and Tito didn't see things eye to eye. Thanks for watching. Please give us a like and subscribe. We've got 3 new videos or more for you every single week. Let us know what you thought of the video in the comments below. Huge shout out to Max Randall for editing this video together. Follow him on Twitter at Max_Randall. Follow On Point MMA on Twitter, and have yourself a wonderful day.
Hunter killer drone deployed.
Everybody loves a little bit of tea. MMA is a business that thrives on rumors, ridiculousness, and revelations by the athletes, the promoters, and anyone associated with them. Fans eat up new and interesting information about their favorite fighters, like candy powder and more candy. But especially so when it's a shocking new bit of info or disgust, the type of confession that rocks us to our very core, or at the least dominates the MMA news cycle for a few days. Today we're going to be looking at 10 times fighters were feeling froggy enough to spill the beans on some aspect of their career or life and had us fans feeling a bit shook. Let's see what everybody's been hiding. I'm Tommy from MMA On Point, and most shocking fighter confessions. Number 10, Colby Covington's gimmick. This may come as a surprise, but Colby Covington didn't enter the UFC wearing a MAGA hat and an interim title with a trail of adult models behind him snacking food out of nerds and virgins' mouths while spoiling blockbusters. Much of the persona Covington has adopted today was a conscious decision to improve his career. Colby has said as much on several occasions, for instance when he was on Brennan Schaub's Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives. Another aspect of the origin story, going at least as far back as January 2019, is that the UFC was going to cut Covington after the Damian Maia fight.
Damian Maia in Brazil. They had told my manager, Dan Lambert, that they weren't going to re-sign me. They didn't like my style.
But he called Brazil a dump and lived happily ever after. The most notable version of this confession came recently on internet person Candace Owens' show when Colby laid the whole thing out.
When I really took over this bad guy character that I kind of taken in the UFC, I really enjoyed hearing people tell me I can't do something and tell me, you know, that you will die.
Now, we at MMA On Point have already pointed out that Colby actually started his gimmick before he fought Dong Young Kim, as well as refuted his story that he was about to be cut after the Sao Paulo fight. But while Colby may at times be an unreliable narrator, the fact that he chose to break kayfabe, as they say in the wrestling business, and reveal that a major part of his persona is pretty shocking considering he's been so dedicated to portraying it at all times. Number 9. Ali Abdelaziz was poisoned. Manager to about 973 MMA fighters, Ali Abdelaziz is a regular on the Ariel Helwani show, and in February of 2019, the decision to interview him so often became worth its weight in gold. When asked by Ariel about then challenger Kamaru Usman and whether Ben Askren was in his head, wow, do things change quickly in mixed martial arts, the controversial mega manager responded, and I say this in my best Chris Penn voice from Reservoir Dogs, out of the fucking blue, with this tasty confession.
I was poisonous and bad. I was dying, right?
Poison? What do you mean poison?
Yeah, somebody trying to kill me.
That's not exactly something you just throw into casual conversation. Someone cut me off on the way to Starbucks. Hey, did you see that new Star Wars movie? Someone tried to poison me to death, but I cannot be killed. Ali didn't care to elaborate much further, although he did admit that people have been trying to kill him for years, so no biggie.
Listen, people have been trying to kill me for years, but I'm still alive.
Jeez Louise.
Unfortunately, nobody has bothered to look further into this story beyond this one interview, so it's unclear what actually happened and whether anything else came of it, like, I don't know, someone being arrested for attempted murder. So this one will always remain one of the unresolved mysteries of mixed martial arts. You know you said some wild shit, though, when the craziest thing you said during an interview wasn't that Tony Ferguson doesn't deserve a lightweight title fight. Number 8. Conor McGregor's due date. One could argue that Conor McGregor was at the height of his powers directly after UFC 205. He'd avenged his loss to Nate Diaz. He'd won a second world title at the first UFC New York card since the ban on MMA had been lifted, with the biggest gate in the history of the company, the Mayweather fight, less than a year away. There was a lot going on in the champ's life, including, as he would announce at the post-fight press conference, that he was expecting his first child.
I want to announce when I'm going to be a daddy early next year. Yeah. So, thank you.
The theme of the 13-minute presser was very much centered around how much his son's birth could possibly affect his life, as he wasn't sure where this new phase would take him or how it would alter his career. He mentioned becoming a father in nearly every answer to a question during the press conference, so naturally, a reporter followed up to ask when the baby was due.
Can you say when that baby is due? March, I think. Not March, is it? May.
March, May, the guy just had a fist fight and both of those months start with an M. It can happen to anybody. All jokes aside, though, Conor's other confession that he was nervous about the whole fatherhood thing was a very human moment from a guy who, at the time, felt damn near invincible. Number 7. Nick Diaz's unpaid taxes. Nick Diaz had lost the biggest fight of his life against George St. Pierre in the main event of UFC 158 when he began taking questions from media members at the post-fight press conference. In the cage, Nick told Joe Rogan he was considering retirement, and during a follow-up question at the presser related to his future, he dropped this bombshell on everyone seemingly out of nowhere.
No, I've never paid taxes in my life. I didn't go to jail. That's not because I don't have what? You know what? Nobody wants to hear about that, huh?
Now, I'm not a CPA, but if I'm not mistaken, the U.S. government tends to look into people who have never paid taxes in their entire adult lives. But this list is not intended as legal advice, so don't quote me on that. A few days later, Diaz's manager and coach, Cesar Gracie, told the media that Nick was just being wacky, fun-loving Nick, and he totally paid $100,000 in taxes in the last 2 years. But Diaz's lawyer came out after that and said that Nick left his financials to Gracie, who dropped the ball, so now he was helping him square up with Uncle Sam. Gracie denied all of this, and it's still unclear exactly how everything got resolved or how much Diaz owed in back taxes for a lifetime of fight purses, but he's not in jail at the moment, so I'm thinking things worked out because if he hadn't been audited before UFC 158, he surely was after. Number 6. John Jones admits to partying. Everyone is well aware that the light heavyweight GOAT John Jones enjoys a little bit of the bubbly, and his struggles outside the cage have been well documented here, elsewhere, and in New Mexico courthouses. The fact that John likes to party isn't exactly the most earth-shattering confession, but that's not truly what makes this entry so compelling. Jones appeared on the Joe Rogan podcast in December of 2016 for a lengthy 2-hour conversation. The champion was in the darkest period of his career. He had been stripped of his title twice, the hit-and-run incident was in his recent past, and he had failed the drug test to ruin UFC 200. But the former champ was determined to get his shit together, and part of that led to a very candid look into his psyche and what drove his drinking prior to fights. Jones admitted that throughout his entire career as a mental crutch, he would get blackout drunk the week before a fight so that if he lost, he could use his alcohol abuse as an excuse for why he had failed.
1 week before every fight, I would go out and I would get blacked out wasted. If this guy were to beat me somehow, I could look myself in the mirror and say that, well, I lost because I got hammered the week before the fight.
He elaborated further on his pre-fight rituals when he discussed a razor-thin decision win over Alexander Gustafsson at UFC 165.
How much did you train for that fight?
I trained for the fight, but I definitely had this thing where I just felt invincible. I did a lot of wild stuff leading up to the fight. I definitely did give it my all.
John's dark confession is just a reminder of how incredible his in-ring ability is, as is his penchant for self-destruction. Number 5. George St. Pierre's lost time. Joe Rogan's podcast is apparently the place to go for confessing some wild shit. About 10 minutes into an episode back in 2013, Rogan and then welterweight champion George St. Pierre had already got to discussing aliens. 5 minutes later, Rogan was explaining DMT. But sandwiched in the middle, a shocking confession by St. Pierre about a phenomenon called lost time.
Sometimes I'm looking at the clock It's like I wake up and I look at the clock right after, and it's like the clock advanced like 4 hours or 2 hours.
St. Pierre called his experience a third type encounter, meaning he believed these time gaps to be from alien interaction. He did posit that he might also just be crazy.
I'm crazy, or maybe it really happened, but I hope that I'm crazy.
GSP's odd confession and the conviction with which he presented it caused concern that George may be suffering from neurological issues caused by head trauma. Even Joe asked GSP if these events occurred after hard sparring days, but he told him it had been happening since he was a kid. Joe then contemplated if St. Pierre was actually manufactured by aliens to be the perfect MMA fighter, and things moved on from there, believe it or not. But this is not the only alien-related story GSP has told. He also claims to have seen a UFO in Albuquerque while riding in a car with Rashad Evans and Ali Abdelaziz, because Ali doesn't already have enough insanity in his life with people trying to kill him constantly. Now he has to worry about aliens too. It's tough managing 4,000 fighters. Number 4, Darren Till's fake injury plan. Being candid during interviews is a great way to endear yourself with fans, but Darren Till took that to a different level after his UFC 244 win over Kelvin Gastelum. Till was on a 2-fight losing streak dating back to September of 2018, the first losses of his career, and both in devastating fashion. He was also arrested for stealing a cab while on vacation in early 2019. Till was supposed to be the next big thing, and now he was moving up a weight class to try and salvage his career and get back on track against a very tough welcoming committee. On top of all that, Darren had visa issues which delayed his arrival on fight week. How did all that pressure and all those difficulties affect Till?
To tell you the utmost truth, I didn't even want to go out there tonight. I was thinking of ways to like fake an injury. And
I know the accent can be tough, so let me repeat that for you. He was considering faking an injury backstage before his walkout so he wouldn't have to compete. Fighters have talked about the fear before and been candid about what it's like to compete, but nobody has been so brutally honest as to very plainly state the fear and anxiety was so great that they would opt out of a lot of cash and sabotage an event, possibly ruining their career in the process just to get away from it. And yet he still made the walk. Impressive. Number 3, Mark Coleman's fixed pride fight. Japanese pro wrestling legend Nobuhiko Takada had lost to Rickson Gracie in 2 main events in 2 consecutive years at Pride 1 and Pride 4. In the early days of the promotion, it was important that Japanese stars like Takada thrive in order to ensure Pride would become the powerhouse we knew it as. So it is widely believed that Nobuhiko participated in a fixed bout with former UFC champion Mark Coleman, who was making his promotional debut at Pride 5. One need only watch the bout to see that things are not right. After giving up position for no reason and clearly underutilizing his size and abilities, Coleman was tapped to a heel hook in the 2nd round. Mark had lost 3 straight in the UFC prior to the 1999 bout, and with very few money-making opportunities in mixed martial arts during the late 90s, Coleman accepted the fight. Almost a decade after Pride disbanded, in an interview with Jonathan Snowden, Coleman would give about as close to a confession as we're going to get in regards to whether this fight was fixed. When asked about the bout, Mark said, "It was what it was. I needed to support my family. They guaranteed me another fight after that, and I needed that security. It was what it was. I'm going to leave it at that. I think I will too." Number 2, Michael Bisping's eye. UFC Hall of Famer Michael Bisping's late career resurgence and eventual capture of the middleweight title is the stuff of legends. But things became even more incredible 2 full years after he retired, when on his podcast, Believe You Me, in October of 2019, Mike made this shocking confession along with a demonstration.
I wore my glasses, my dark glasses, as I said, to hide from the commission. I mean, get a load of this. Check this out. Look at this, baby boys.
What? Michael Bisping has a fake eye. He has an eye that's not real, that can't see. Excuse me for just a moment. Holy shit. Now, of course, this is massive news if, he became world champion with half his vision. Issues with the eye began after a brutal head kick by Mitchell Duffel back in 2013, but it's unclear when Michael began using the fake eye, as he did reportedly have surgery in 2018. To what extent the eye was damaged previous to that is not clear. Even if the eye wasn't fake until recently, that doesn't guarantee he had full vision at any point after 2013. UFC President Dana White was asked about the shocking reveal and wasn't buying it.
You aren't duping the doctor. I mean, the doctors look into your eyes.
Right, the fucking douche.
I would hope that the doctor would know the difference between a fly ball and a fake eyeball.
But hey, Kevin Lee tricked the commission by covering up a staph infection with some makeup, so who knows? Whether his eye is only fake now or has been fake for years, the deterioration is real and likely occurred because of fighting and at some point in his career. Legend. Number 1. The UFC lawsuit documents. The ongoing UFC antitrust lawsuit that was brought forth by a group of former fighters back in 2014 has been a treasure trove of never-before-released public information about Zuffa's inner workings. The court documents have given us a look into how the UFC does business through candid text messages, emails, as well as depositions that cover deals with their athletes. Some interesting revelations: how the UFC was throwing fighters who chose not to re-sign on the prelims against tough opponents in their last contracted fight, how they automatically extend contracts on injured fighters so they have a longer period of time before they must offer them another bout, as well as how their pay-per-view point structure has worked. In addition, many smaller tidbits came out in the wash, like Dana White thinking Bellator sucks at promoting and never planned on paying Gilbert Melendez a huge contract if he left the UFC. They were only jacking up his market value. ESPN telling the UFC the deal with Reebok was great for business. Pride CEO getting paid $10 million to stay out of MMA for 7 years. The UFC believing exclusive fighter contracts are vital to obtaining TV rights, and so much more. Way too much to list in just this one entry. Look for future videos on this one though, because who knows what else might come from this suit in the future. Huge shout out to Steven Denson for editing this video together and driving the white Hummer that smashed Kevin Nash on Nitro. Follow him on Twitter at FightTalk_. Thanks for watching. Please give us a like and subscribe. We got 3 new videos or more for you every single week. Let us know what you thought of the video in the comments below. Follow On Point MMA on Twitter and have yourself a wonderful day.
Predator missile inbound. Friendly sentry gun deployed. Friendly Predator missile inbound. Enemy sentry gun has been destroyed.
As a fight fan, you can't help but love a good comeback story. But in equal measure, it's impossible to look away when a fighter's return doesn't exactly go according to plan. This has happened so many times in so many ways that are truly unforgettable, for better or for worse. Today we're going to look into both of those occasions where these returns totally changed the game. Ordered this list by how big they were in terms of box office and how memorable they were. So that means it's not necessarily just the biggest sells, but also those indelible memories that came along with them. And frankly, there are just too many good ones to stay at just a top 10. Buckle in, because this is going to be a long one. I'm Jason from MMA on Point, and these are the 15 most memorable returns in MMA history. Number 15, Tank Abbott. When you think about throwback stars in MMA, Tank Abbott fits that description pretty much perfectly. It wasn't exactly the most skilled or the most technical, but to his credit, he was super popular and had earned some very memorable knockouts. But it didn't last that long. After only about 3 years and an awful 8-7 record, Tank took his ball and joined the WCW. He wasn't exactly a splash hit, but still it did keep his name out there, so when Zuffa purchased the nearly bankrupt UFC, they employed some extreme measures as they looked to revive the sport. That's when they started bringing back some of the old stars who were already far past their expiration date to bump up the numbers. This included guys like Tank Abbott and Kimo Leopoldo. And man, did they try hyping it up, complete with a totally badass leather jacket, bro, in an old-school WWF-style warehouse in the background of his hype videos, with a way over-the-top walkout to go along with it. Tank Abbott was set to return, but all the marketing in the world couldn't save him, though, as he lost in just 41 seconds to Frank Mir by a toe hold. He fought just 2 more times, including a submission loss to the aforementioned Kimo Leopoldo before he moved on to other organizations, and losing again most famously to Kimbo Slice. Number 14, Robbie Lawler. Many forget how long Robbie Lawler has been around. Starting back in 2001, he's just as much a pioneer of the sport as he is one of the most popular stars in the sport today. He was actually the first man to fight on cable television at UFC 37.5 for a one-off show far before the UFC inked a long-term deal with Fox, or even Spike TV for that matter. Many people remember his fight with Nick Diaz that gained both fighters much attention, as it just so happened to occur on the exact same night as Chuck Liddell finally fighting Tito Ortiz for the first time. But he did end up losing that fight, and again when trying to move up to middleweight for his next fight against the Tanner. This set him on through several promotions before getting picked up by Strikeforce, and by the time the UFC bought out the promotion, it looked like perhaps his best days were behind him, as he lost 3 of his last 4 fights. Clearly this changed something for him though. After 8 years, he would make his return to the UFC in the welterweight division against Josh Koscheck. And sure enough, Lawler would make short work of him and get the finish brutally by stopping Koscheck in the first round. There was some controversy with some calling it an early stoppage, but it definitely wasn't a fluke. He ended up becoming champion in the incredibly stacked division, and had 2 of the best title fights in MMA history against Rory McDonald and Carlos Condit. Number 13, Mark Kerr. At one time, Mark Kerr was the undefeated 11-0 uncrowned baddest man on the planet. He'd won a tournament with World Valley Tudo Championships and 2 with UFC 14 and UFC 15 respectively in the heavyweight division. Not only was he massive in the unregulated PED era and an incredibly strong wrestler, but he was also great with submissions. And he's the only guy to my knowledge to have ever won a UFC tournament with a chin to the eye submission. Of course, he knew conventional submissions too, even beating Josh Barnett in an ADCC in 2000 with a Kimura. But that all came crashing down as he documented his rise and fall beautifully in the smashing machine that witnessed his addiction to painkillers and troubled personal life take control of him. This led to some memorable losses like the insane Fujita loss that saw him expel all of his energy and freeze up on the ground, then his rematch loss before vocation, and again by brutal knees to Keith Haring that sent him a 3-year hiatus. When he came back, fans hoped to see the time off renew his vigor for competition, but it was immediately apparent we weren't even looking at the same man, and in upsetting fashion while going for a takedown, Kerr actually knocked himself out by hitting his head on the canvas. He'd fight 9 more times after this, but he'd only win twice more before retiring in 2009. Number 12, Fedor Emelianenko. After setting the world on fire with a nearly 10-year undefeated streak in Pride and later on against former UFC champions, there was no better talent in MMA, including the UFC. So that's why it was so shocking when the loss finally came in 2010 to Fabricio Verdun. The world was stunned, and after 2 losses to Bigfoot Silva and Dan Henderson, Fedor closed out his career on a high note with 3 low-profile wins in 2012. He was moving on to a political life in Russia, and it felt like the right time to many for him to hang up the gloves for good. But sure enough, as it does for many fighters, the fight game was just too alluring to stay away from. Fedor began openly talking about a return in 2015. And so at Bellator Dynamite, he appeared with none other than Pride former president Sakiki Barra to announce his return to MMA. And on that night, he didn't announce an opponent, but did announce he would be fighting in Japan for a special New Year's Eve show, just like the old promise. So fans were excited to hear he was back, and speculation was rampant on who he might fight. But then, a couple of weeks later, famed MMA journalist Ariel Helwani announced who he was fighting, Jadit Singh. I don't even know if I'm saying, to be honest. He was a fighter who only had 1 win when this was announced. Fans were less than pleased with such a lackluster opponent, and sure enough, he dispatched of him in 3 minutes into round 1. If the opponent were any more formidable, this easily could have ranked much higher, but it certainly took things down a few notches. Number 11, Anderson Silva. Speaking of who many consider the greatest of all time, here is another of the pound-for-pound GOAT contenders, Anderson Silva. After dominating the UFC middleweight division from 2006 to 2013 and losing by a wild KO to Chris Weidman, Silva was back for redemption at the close of the year to face Weidman once more as the title was on the line again. But in perhaps the most insane turn of events, the fight would end by a graphic warning, 3, 2, 1, you've been warned, stomach-turning leg kick that many thought could have even been the end of his career. So when it was announced that just over a year later, UFC 183, he'd not only be having a dream fight with Nick Diaz, the MMA world could not have been more excited. Unfortunately, though, aside from some amazing moments from Diaz clowning Anderson in highly entertaining ways, the fight itself was a bit of a dud, which was by decision. What made this even more memorable, though, was that Silva failed his pre-fight drug test, pre-USADA, mind you, with 2 anabolic steroids in his system. Subsequently, his win over Diaz was overturned to a no contest. His defense? An off-brand sexual enhancement drug that led to the most bizarre and hilarious hearings with the Nevada State Athletic Commission. A circus where fans somehow figured out a way to call into the hearings and make this happen. Pat Lundvall was unimpressed and his defense was rejected. Number 10, Vanderlei Silva. By the time Vanderlei Silva had finally made his way to the UFC, his career was already the stuff of legend. He held the most wins in Pride history with 22, the longest undefeated streak with 20 wins, the most knockouts with 15, and the most finishes overall in a tie with Mirko Cro Cop with 16 each. On that, he ruled the Pride middleweight division from 2001 to 2006 and even won a tournament that included Chuck Liddell, Alistair Overeem, Sakuraba, and Rampage Jackson. Unfortunately, though, by the time he came to the UFC, he already suffered 2 incredibly brutal knockout cold losses to Cro Cop and Dan Henderson that would start a downturn in his career he would never recover from. Needless to say, he was one of the most recognizable athletes in the sport, and he could already make this list with an incredible fight he'd end up losing to Chuck Liddell in one of the best fights in MMA history. That marked his first fight returning to the UFC after 7 years. But it was after his fight with Rich Franklin that he had a short layoff for some much-needed surgeries. What kind of surgeries, you ask? Well, just in case you questioned his dedication to the sport, he finally repaired his nose that he'd broken repeatedly since the second pro comp fight, sleep apnea, and specifically got scar tissue removed from his eyes so they wouldn't actually bleed easily during his fights. The result? I'll let Joe Rogan sum it up. It's by far the shortest time on this list away with only 8 months, but as he returned that night to fight Michael Bisping, infamous is only one of many you could put. Number 9, Cain Velasquez. Peak condition Cain Velasquez is considered by many to be the greatest heavyweight of all time. Fedor has even mentioned him many times to be one of the best in the sport from his view.
Scott Coker has said you're the best fighter ever. Many people agree with that. What you do say?
Well, I liked really very much Cain Velasquez, but he's not fighting nowadays, I guess.
After he closed out the amazing trilogy with JDS, a dominant fighter in his own right and undefeated man prior to their trilogy, many questioned who could possibly challenge Cain for the title and offered him any real competition after that. What just so happened to be that the man who also beat Fedor, Fabricio Verdum, crossed over to the UFC after the Strikeforce acquisition and had amassed an impressive 4-fight win streak as the clear new challenger. But the now all too familiar string of injuries happened as they have plagued the latter half of his career, in which Verdum won the interim title against Mark Hunt while he was out when they were originally supposed to fight at UFC 180. So after nearly 2 years away, Velasquez was set to return against Verdum at UFC 188 in Mexico City for the undisputed crown. In an absolute role reversal of all reversals, the man called Cardio Cain became noticeably fatigued and by the third round became an easy target for Verdum to pick apart, which he easily did first on the feet and then ended up catching Cain in a guillotine while going for a takedown. As it's well known now, the high elevation of Mexico City was the tragic flaw for Cain in his preparation. While Verdum spent around a month acclimating to the conditions, Velasquez reportedly only spent about a week in the environment that turned out to be his downfall. Credit to Verdum as well, but that clearly wasn't the best version of Cain. Number 8, Nick Diaz. One of the most popular fighters in MMA history that is sometimes lost on new fans, I think, because he hasn't fought since 2015, and now those that have started watching since then only know his brother. But if you remember watching him back in the day, he was just a massive star and still is despite the inactivity. And as mentioned earlier, he became a huge star fighting Robbie Lawler with his breakout performance at UFC 47. The rest of his early UFC career was a bit hit and miss, and he eventually found himself also in Strikeforce. Unlike Lawler, though, he became the king of the welterweight division in the organization, and by the time the UFC acquired Strikeforce, he was on an impressive 10-fight win streak. And during this time, he became sort of an anti-hero. He wasn't showing up to press conferences in a suit that threatened reporters.
Do you not like me, Nick?
I feel like you instigate fights quite a bit, but that's
Fights between the fighters?
yeah. I mean, maybe that's your job, but I come from people like that get slapped.
He certainly wasn't there to be a role model. What he was there to do was put on incredible fights and box the hell out of his opponents or submit them. It was a no-brainer decision for the UFC to pluck him out of Strikeforce before they closed it and immediately booked him in a match champion versus champion against George St. Pierre. So on the day of the highly anticipated first press conference between the two, Diaz was absent. He would later post a video going after the UFC in the intense press schedule saying that he missed his flight while criticizing them for kicking him off the card for missing the presser. It was already a memorable occasion for his return back to the UFC in 5 years, so as a result of all this, he was then booked against BJ Penn, and instead Carlos Condit would get the title shot. Bizarrely though, St. Pierre would end up suffering an injury, and as a result, Diaz would end up headlining the card despite everything, and he ended up fighting BJ Penn where he'd win by decision. It was a memorable circumstance, incredible return performance to the UFC against BJ, and who could forget his legendary follow-up after the fight.
I don't think George is hurt. I think he's scared. I think he's scared to fight everybody right now. What's up? Where you at, George?
Number 7, Brock Lesnar. At UFC 199, just 1 month away from UFC 200, the UFC played a promo trailer for 200 that was good in its own way, promoting the stat card, but then still featured Jones versus Cormier 2 before the ill-fated drug test with Jones off the phone. While we all focused on that being hyped up, the trailer seemingly ended, but then...
Go ahead.
Joe Rogan's reaction here pretty much summed it up for the rest of us watching at home.
What does that mean? Is that real? That's real.
Here was Brock Lesnar, out of nowhere fighting at UFC 200. For many, the question wasn't just who, but also how, especially when you consider he was supposed to be in the USADA testing pool for 6 months prior to even be eligible. But a controversial, beyond controversial loophole was exploited because he was technically retired, which allowed him to be exempt from pre-testing. It personally doesn't really make any sense to me, neither did it to anybody else, but either way he was able to begin pre-fight testing like normal as a result of it. He would go on to win the fight, but that was quickly overturned to a no contest because, surprise, surprise, he ended up actually failing his pre-fight drug test. Twice. And you want to know what his defense was? Footprint. I don't think so, Brock. Either way, though, it was probably that fight that saved the card in terms of pay-per-view buys, since Jones popped as well before the fight and was ineligible to compete. So this return was memorable in that sense, in addition to the sudden announcement of his return. And there's, of course, the legal battle Mark Hunt filed after his loss that he's still fighting against the UFC today. Number 6, Dominic Cruz. Dominic Cruz is one of my favorite all-time fighters. He's definitely in my top 5. And this is honestly my personal number 1 for the list. But I have to be fair, and memorable has to be weighted heavily on star power and sheer number of people who will remember it. He's certainly not as big a box office star as Brock, but how incredible this return is can't be ignored and deserves to be ranked so highly. At this point, he had only 1 loss in his career in 2007 to Uriah Faber, and had since avenged that loss in 2011. He was on a 10-fight win streak, and 5 of those wins were title fights that also happened to include Demetrius Johnson. He was so dominant and on a high note going into the first and only live season The Ultimate Fighter ever back in 2012, where he was scheduled to fight Uriah Faber again in a high-profile grudge match to close out their rivalry. But as fate would have it, he suffered one of the worst injuries an athlete can have, and that was a torn ACL.
Son of a bitch, man.
Would sideline him for at least a year. But at the end of 2012, Cruz's
Shouldn't be that hard to
actually
fucking get him.
the cadaver ACL he was given. So this meant he was sidelined again. Fast forward to February 1st, 2014, he was scheduled to return against the interim champion while he was out and in Barao. Unfortunately, this was a fight we'd never get to see because that fell apart when Cruz tore his groin ahead of that fight. Finally, after 2 years out, the UFC stripped him of his title and named Barao the undisputed champion. But somehow Cruz pulled through and returned again against Takeya Mizugaki in a fight that he resoundingly earned by KO in round 1. It was thought his dark days were finally past him. But this was short-lived because just after being promised the title shot against the man to dethrone around his absence, TJ Dillashaw, life was especially cruel to him as he tore the ACL in his other knee, meaning this would now be the 3rd time he'd have this surgery done. It blows my mind he didn't retire through all of this, considering he was and is such a great analyst who could live easily off of that life. But miraculously, he pulled through and finally on January 17th, 2016, Dominic Cruz challenged TJ Dillashaw for the title he never lost. And even more stunning was that he won the split decision despite suffering a new injury through the last couple of rounds of the fight with plantar fascia tendonitis that he'd been dealing with before the fight. It's a story you couldn't have written better if you tried, and his return is one of my personal favorite fights to watch in MMA history. It's just that good. Number 5, Randy Couture. Unlike many of the other entries on this list, Couture actually has 2 awe-inspiring returns. After upsetting the odds on 3 separate occasions, one by being an unknown winning the UFC 13 heavyweight tournament, then later flipping the world on its head by beating the unbeatable-looking young phenom Vitor Belfort, and then again gaining the heavyweight title from Maurice Smith. Couture had quickly established himself in just 4 career fights as one of the very best in the sport. This would be cast into doubt, though, as he would lose twice after vacating the UFC title and fighting in Japan. But he would regain momentum shortly after with 2 more wins before returning to the UFC after 3 years off and competing against the much bigger and younger wrestler in Kevin Randleman when he was already 37 years old. It was another fight people just assumed he would lose, that he actually ended up dominating himself and turned the tables to stop Randleman in the third round by using his own ground and pound tactics against him. I know, memorable already, but fast forward past capturing the title from Chuck Liddell at light heavyweight, but then eventually losing to him twice, the last at age 42, it made all the sense in the world for him to retire after another devastating knockout loss. So nearly a year had gone by and the world was prepared to move on. But that's when Couture suddenly announced that he was not only returning, but would be at heavyweight and he'd be facing Tim Sylvia, the 6'8" reigning champion who was barely 30 by the time they'd fight, and Couture was 43. It was a fight Couture was sure to lose, but just as legendary as his career was, all throughout all the upsets stemming back to May 30th, 1997 when he debuted at UFC 13, Couture not only won the fight by unanimous decision, but almost knocked out Sylvia and submitted him immediately in the first round. It's just one of the many reasons Randy Couture will forever be one of the most revered athletes and pioneers of the sport. Number 4, Georges St. Pierre. With 9 consecutive title defenses, 13 overall in one of the most stacked divisions, perhaps only second to 155 pounds, it's beyond impressive what he accomplished. But his last win was a controversial one over Johnny Hendricks, and when he said he was taking time away from the sport, there was plenty of reason to believe it spelled retirement. But many hoped he would come back, and although it was a long time off with strange negotiation tactics played out in the public by Dana White claiming he wasn't a fighter anymore, and on again, off again booking against middleweight champion Michael Bisping, it was finally settled that he challenged Bisping for his title at UFC 217 in Madison Square Garden. The booking in return was huge, but there was a ton of doubts, many of it stemming from his extended time off from competition, moving up in weight for the first time, and he didn't look so good in many of what fans saw of him leading up to the fight in his camp. At the time, it looked like he was just kind of out of shape after the layoff, but no one knew he was battling ulcerative colitis at the time, which is an intestinal disorder that severely affected his fight camp leading up to it. As GSP said himself, they were very close to pulling out of the fight because of that. Luckily, this all seemed to turn around just in time, and as rarely happens in MMA today, the 3 biggest fights on the card all stayed intact. After an incredible night of fights, GSP proved to be the showstopper, and despite some trouble in the second round, he recovered in spectacular fashion, finishing the champion in round 3 by rear naked choke. It was a stunning return that showed just how talented GSP still was, and that he might have even improved during his time off. Number 3, Ronda Rousey. Back in her day, there was perhaps no bigger star the sport had ever seen. In fact, she broke 1 million pay-per-view buys before Conor did his first time in 2015, with UFC 189 falling just shy of that distinction. In that same year, she was the 3rd most Googled person in the entire world. If I'm being honest, I think the backlash she's gotten has been well-deserved for her own behavior in terms of totally shutting out the sport and blaming fans plus media for many of her own issues. But whether you personally like her or not doesn't make her record invalid. That doesn't matter. Kat Zingano is the last person to beat the current champion as of this recording, Amanda Nunes, and Ronda beat her in just 14 seconds. If you dislike someone, you don't have to discredit every element of their existence, and that's what I think a lot of fans try to unfairly do with her record. What was exposed, though, was of course her loss to Holly Holm that was so dominant and so definitive that everyone realized how bad her striking on the feet really was. Perhaps previous opponents just gave her much too much respect based on how big she was back then. And again, discussing the underrated strength of Ronda's record, the woman she defeated twice definitively by armbar, one gruesomely, Miesha Tate beat Holly Holm in her absence. This was a night that solidified the rear naked choke as a brutal finisher in fans' minds forever. But then Miesha Tate got completely dominated herself by Amanda Nunes at UFC 200. So when Ronda was ready to return, it was just over a year after her loss at UFC 207. It was indeed a huge question of whether Ronda had a chance against another brutal striker. That question couldn't have been answered more resoundingly, as Ronda was frankly nothing more than a punching bag in that fight, and her career came crashing down in that same instant. So this was memorable not just because of how big she was, but also the way the UFC mishandled the promotion. In the build-up, the UFC lent almost no time to Amanda Nunes and focused solely on Rousey's return. Because Because of it, I believe it's the reason neither then nor now do fans even really know who Nunes is. On top of this, Rousey did absolutely no press in terms of traditional press conferences or media. This is notable because it even got Conor McGregor kicked off of UFC 200 for refusing media. It's a shame how it all went down, and with just a bit more humility on her part, perhaps she'd be remembered better by MMA fans. But it's a tragic end to her career and title reign that won't soon be forgotten. Number 2, Conor McGregor. With the high-profile entry of Ronda's loss and this new one too with McGregor, you can't help but draw comparisons between the two. This one, though, took place on the biggest stage by far. In October 2018, estimates for pay-per-view sales are currently listed at about 2.4 million. An absolutely shattering achievement in comparison to the previous record of 1.65 million buys by Conor and Nate Diaz held 2 years earlier at UFC 202. Conor would capture the lightweight title just a couple of months later at UFC 205 against Eddie Alvarez, making him the first two-weight world champion, which, if I'm being honest, is a bit of a bullshit distinction. The only two people to do this in history are the two belts he held and the two Daniel Cormier held. Conor McGregor was stripped of his first belt less than a month after winning the second one, and Cormier is said to be getting stripped of his when Jones faces Gustafsson at UFC 232. In my opinion, they basically just traded out one title for the other since neither actually defended the first one. Either way, when Conor was finally ready to come back after his insane one-off boxing fight with Floyd Mayweather, he decided to do it in a rather disgraceful way. In response to a confrontation Khabib Nurmagomedov had with Conor's teammate Artem Lobov, Conor flew to New York during Khabib's UFC 223 press obligations and attacked the bus he was on, demanding a fight. Instead of getting a fight, though, he needlessly injured fighters and got them medically pulled from their fights that weekend, something he is facing lawsuits for still to this day. But the UFC didn't punish him at all. And in fact, they used it for promotion for UFC 229 when the two were set to settle their issues in the cage. In the promotion, Conor took things even further, attacking Khabib's family, his way of life, and personal connections that have so many far-reaching implications I'm not fully prepared to fit it into just one small entry. Trust me, I've made a 30-minute video about that. But anyhow, this all culminated in McGregor losing emphatically in a one-sided title fight that Khabib dominated from the opening bell with little success from McGregor at all. And pretty much right after this was when the melee outside occurred, and then subsequently inside the cage as well. On this channel, we talked a lot about how big the numbers were heading into their fight, but the fallout of this was way bigger, with the post-fight press conference dwarfing the pre-fight ones. It's a main event that will certainly live in infamy for its disgraceful build-up with Conor and reciprocal finish with Khabib. Number 1, Ken Shamrock. Where do you even go after a mess like UFC 229? Well, you certainly don't go any bigger in terms of sales. You go historical. And while Shamrock isn't known for necessarily having the greatest return in terms of success, it perhaps is the most important one that laid the foundation for every fight that happens in the UFC today. What you can never take away from Shamrock is his place in history. He was fighting in Japan for Pancrase just before the UFC began, and he fought at UFC 1 as one of the sport's two first stars alongside Royce Gracie, where he'd actually lose to Gracie in the semifinals. That began the first UFC rivalry as well. In the early days, he held wins over Funaki twice, Matt Hume, Bas Rutten twice, Murray Smith, Dan Severn, and Kimo Leopoldo before moving on to WWF for a few years. And although I'm not a fan of pro wrestling, there is no doubting it did a tremendous amount to raise his profile while he was on hiatus from MMA. And one of the biggest precursors to his return would be after Tito Ortiz beat Guy Metzger in 1999 for their rematch. He celebrated by wearing a t-shirt calling Metzger his bitch, setting off Ken Shamrock, who was in the corner that night. Before their fight would take place, though, Ken Shamrock would first make his debut in Pride after 4 years off from the sport. His first fight back wasn't the most thrilling matchup against Alexander Otsuka, but he did have an incredible fight with Don Frye that's one of the absolute best in Pride in MMA history. But the fight that everyone wanted to see was the Tito Ortiz fight. By 2002, Tito was far and away the biggest star of the promotion. It couldn't have worked out any better that he and the now more popular than ever Ken Shamrock absolutely hated each other. It was a fight that the then fledgling UFC and its still new owners and the Fertittas were all too aware of and were ready to capitalize on. So it finally happened after 6 years away from the UFC. He made his return to challenge Fertitta's light heavyweight title. At the time, it was an unprecedented level of attention and press in the dark ages of MMA in America. When it was all said and done, Tito was able to dominate the fight, although Ken did show a great deal of heart, but Prime Tito was on top of his game at that moment in time. The pay-per-view sold a measly 100,000 buys by today's standards, but it was a new record for Zutla's UFC at the time, and although it wasn't the game changer The Ultimate Fighter was a couple of years later, it was certainly an island of success in an era of drowning debt that perhaps if that didn't take place, we might not even be looking at the UFC today.
To predict the future of this wild sport. I saw it. Like, I don't know, I saw it. We take pride in spotting prospects early in their career and sit back smugly whilst they go on to achieve the sporting heights you foresaw all those years ago. However, with the margin for error so small in MMA, career paths often take unexpected turns for the worse.
Hey, do you want to know why literally hundreds of thousands of investors are getting their advice from Motley Fool Stock Advisor? Well, it's simple. Our average stock has returned 368%, and that's more than 3 times the return of the S&P 500. And we do it without risky investments likely to burn a hole in your portfolio. When you become a member of Motley Fool Stock Advisor, we'll send you 2 new stock picks each month. Each one of these high-conviction stocks is personally vetted by our founders, David and Tom Gardner. Some of their greatest early bird picks include Amazon, up over 11,000%, Priceline, up over 8,000%, and Netflix, up over 17,000%. Believe me, we hear it over and over from investors. I wish I had bought some of these stocks when they were first recommended by the Motley Fool. I'd be sitting on a gold mine. And it's true. Returns like that can turn $10,000 into over $1 million. I have to tell you what that kind of money can mean to you, but I will. It could mean an early retirement, taking those dream vacations, or just giving back and sharing with others. Now, David and Tom are always on the search for the next Amazon, the next Netflix or Priceline, and they've recommended dozens of big winners in Stock Advisor. And that's why I think you'll be interested in this. They put together a special report called 5 Stocks for Building Wealth. And because they want you to have a head start on the new decade, they are offering it absolutely free of charge. No strings attached. You can grab your copy of 5 Stocks for Building Wealth for free for a limited time only. Don't look back 5 years from now regretting that you failed to act. Simply enter your email and we'll send you your 5 free stock picks directly to your inbox.
No matter what sport it is or talent-based profession, there's a moment of spark that happens, a glimmer of the future, something that foretells the potential of any individual that they may hold. NBA scouts witnessed it in Kobe Bryant or LeBron James' high school games, in college football with Tom Brady or Lawrence Taylor. These moments are a window into what could be. MMA is no different, and that's what we'll look at today. In some cases, these instances would almost mirror the future in an uncannily accurate way, and in others highlight the unpredictability and brutal techniques that would make them the most feared fighters on the planet. I'm Jason from MMA On Point, and these are the 10 most devastating UFC moments of future UFC champions. Number 10, Eddie Alvarez versus Aaron Riley. Without a doubt, this story is one of the best foreshadowing moments of a future UFC champion's title win. The year is 2006, and Eddie Alvarez is just 9-0. In fact, he had never fought outside of New Jersey, with his home state and hometown in Philly not having legalized MMA yet. So instead, he made the hour-and-a-half drive or so every few months to New Jersey, where it was regulated. Here he was 3 years after his career began, fighting the 9-year veteran who fought huge names like Eve Edwards, Robbie Lawler, Chris Lytle, and Spencer Fisher, and by this date, he already had 2 UFC stints and a win in Pride. Alvarez was fighting Aaron Riley. For this one, they are both pretty far away from home, competing in the now-defunct Bodog fighting promotion in Russia, mostly known for hosting Fedor versus Matt Lindland at a later event and colossally outspending themselves while also failing so badly in pay-per-view that they had to shut their doors for good within a year after this fight. Background information aside, you get the picture. Eddie Alvarez was a fish out of water, fighting on the international scene for one of the first times in his life against a much more experienced fighter. At least that's how the records and odds made it seem. In the opening seconds of round 1, Eddie Alvarez landed 2 huge shots, even knocking down Riley momentarily. Riley would try to shoot for a single leg, but there was just no taking Alvarez down. This led to Alvarez swarming on Riley so heavily that the ref was forced to stop the bout. Nearly exactly mirroring the way that he would stop Rafael dos Anjos, also in the first round to win the UFC's lightweight title nearly 10 years later. Number 9, Lyoto Machida versus Rich Franklin. Rarely do you look back in history and see two future legends meet not only so far ahead of their prestigious title reigns, but also at such a massive show that UFC, at least for Western eyes, that's because it happened on the other side of the planet. Rich Franklin was certainly the more experienced man with a 14-0 record against the just 2-0 Lyoto Machida when this fight took place for the special New Year's event Inoki Bumbaye in 2003. If you didn't catch that title, Inoki means Antonio Inoki, the famous pro wrestler and man to fight Muhammad Ali several decades earlier, and you might also recognize Bumbaye because it's taken as an ode to Ali. As a callback to their fight, it's what was chanted at George Foreman before Ali would upset him, meaning kill him. Turns out Brazilian fans aren't that crazy for chanting something similar after all. Well, it pretty much explains why the show was so big in Japan, although it was not a Pride event and was attended like one. Oh hey, there's Bruce Buffer there too. Anyhow, in this fight, you not only saw the Matador-like karate style of Machida, but also more of the grappling that you would rarely witness in his early UFC career. This no doubt puzzled Franklin in the first round, leading to a knockdown about 4 minutes into it. No doubt a shutout round for Machida, something we'd all come to expect out of his career at one point. But the best moment of the fight obviously came with the finishing sequence just a minute into round 2. Upon further inspection of the slow-mo footage, you realize that the big kick that first rocked Franklin wasn't just any kick, but rather a crane kick, most famously used first by his training partner Anderson Silva, and of course what he himself would use to great effect against Randy Couture and later Vitor Belfort. The way in which he utterly baffled his extremely well-respected opponent was fully reflective in his featured wins, and the manner in which it happened was even more illuminating. We all need to thank Steven Seagal because he taught him this kick 8 years after this already happened.
Well, nobody knows the kick. I'm teaching it to Machida and Machida-kun and Anderson and a few of the Brazilians, but we haven't really used it much yet. I haven't shown it to many people yet.
Number 8, Fabricio Verdum versus Gabriel Gonzaga 1. Speaking of signature moves, this one is a bit more cartoony, but it's probably more indicative of a fighter's overall personality because it's just so weird. Remember when Fabricio Verdum almost fought Edmond Tarverdyan after he beat Travis Brown? Well, perhaps that overshadowed the moment that was also very ridiculous because it was this really strange jumping sidekick technique that he did in the early opening seconds of the first round. Well, it turns out this isn't the first time he's ever done it. Way back in the day, in September of 2003, Fabricio Verdum took on the man who pulled out one of the craziest upsets in history by KOing Mirko Krokop and then challenging for the UFC title, Gabriel Gonzaga. Verdum only had 3 fights to his name as he was first transitioning from his championship BJJ career into MMA. Gonzaga, on the other hand, had just 2 fights back then. But they were both undefeated, and it was a great clash between future big names internationally. And guess how the fight started? Oh shit. the exact same kick he used in his fight with Travis Brown. Fabricio Verdum, you are a character. But more than the silliness, we immediately saw Verdum's incredible talent on full display. And not just on the ground like you'd think. This performance and win by TKO completely foreshadowed the style he would come to be known for en route to winning the UFC title over 10 years later against a world-class opponent who wouldn't lose again until he fought Randy Couture for the UFC title. They also fought again at UFC 80, where Verdum would get the TKO against Gonzaga for an even more literal foretelling of the future. Number 7, Stipe Miocic versus William Penn. It's actually pretty fun to look back at this one because I very clearly remember his pre-UFC streak being huge news out of the regional circuit back in the day, and it's just such a revelatory win that had many, including myself, hyped about his UFC debut. If you're not already aware, Stipe is from Cleveland, Ohio, and by 2011 when this took place, he had only fought just once outside of that city. He was undefeated with every fight coming to an end by KO or TKO, and his opponent certainly isn't as well known today, but fought in bigger promotions to that point like Legacy FC and Bellator, the late William Penn. He had a wild, heavy-hitting style that, as the bout began, you'd expect a wrestler like Stipe to take him down, but as we have rarely seen in his career unless it's just been against some absolute murderers, Stipe didn't back down at all and took the fight to him standing. What we ended up seeing were some heavy exchanges from Penn that had knockout implications with every single punch thrown, but Stipe, in a very similar fashion to what would eventually earn him the title against Fabricio Verdum several years later, saw him wade through the madness and find his opponent's chin with a straighter, more accurate, and targeted punches. Forward. In that moment, we saw the greatness that would follow in his career and title win moving forward. Just 2 fights later, he was in the UFC, and 5 years later, he would begin his landmark reign with the most consecutive title defenses in the UFC's heavyweight division. Number 6, Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Ari Marcel Santos. By the date of this video, Khabib Nurmagomedov has not fought in his home country of Russia since 2011 when this happened in Pro FC, and this would be the last time his father would be able to corner him cage-side because of visa issues in the US where most of his fights were waged until 2019 against Dustin Poirier, but only then it was because he was in Abu Dhabi where that's simply not an issue. His opponent, Ari Marcel Chocolate Santos, definitely has one of the worst records I've ever seen, winning just barely more than he's lost. But you can't say it wasn't a good test because, my God, does he have a shit ton of fights. Today, he has 76 pro bouts and counting, and in 2011 when they fought, he already had 49 by then. This guy is a tried and true veteran who's basically seen everything. And to his credit, he almost took Khabib down if it wasn't for an illegal rope grab that saw a point taken away from him. That aside, though, while Santos was throwing a wide array of techniques including head kicks and haymakers, what we saw shine through was something we are only now beginning to appreciate, and that's Khabib's ability to wage war on the feet. And although I don't think anybody would call these graceful techniques, the brute force and efficiency is all that really matters because it's what made him knock down Santos viciously with a wild leaping uppercut, and then after that is when we really saw the Khabib we've come to know in recent years come alive. Some of the most relentless, unlimited stamina and heavy ground and pound that few of his opponents have ever withstood. Everything you basically know his career to be now was seen throughout this fight until his opponent would ultimately succumb to it. Number 5, John Jones versus Moses Gavin. It was a magical time not too long ago. The time when Anderson Silva, GSP, and BJ Penn were all in their most dominant title reigns. Horrible shit-talking wasn't the norm. Vanderlei Silva still looked like Vanderlei Silva, and oh yeah, Brock Lesnar became UFC champion on a 3-1 record, which of course means USADA wasn't around and picograms didn't exist. I'm talking about the year 2008 when John Jones was called Sexual Chocolate Jones! Oh, cue the emphatic facepalm. Ribs at Jones' side, he fought 7 times, 3 of them in April alone in 2008. That all just so happened to be his debut year as a pro MMA fighter, capitalized by his first UFC win by the end of the year against Andre Gusmao, which has to be one of the most momentous rookie years in MMA history. And it was his last fight before debuting in the UFC against Moses Gavin that, in a string of already superbly impressive finishes, was most vividly realized with his regional light heavyweight title win in Battle Cage Extreme. I'm not going to try to oversell Gavin in any way here, he was just 2-1 at the time, but at least he did fight in bigger promotions like Elite XC and M1, so he did have some things going for his career back then. The thing that really stands out here, though, is just the young, extremely talented fighter in John Jones, who truly threw caution to the wind in this fight. And you really saw everything here: flashy takedowns, Jones' signature elbow ground and pound, guard passes, submission attempts, flying knees, a kind of weird spinning back kick, the spinning elbow technique he became famous for. The only thing left out of all that was a hellacious eye poke. He even started the fight with a head kick. He was just ultra creative and completely unafraid of his opponent. Just a couple of minutes into the second round, Moses had enough, and the writing was on the wall.
Yeah, that's it. Stop it before he gets hurt because he had enough.
You will rarely find a showcase as good as this one for UFC for a future champ that boasts just so many future signature techniques in such a short amount of time. Number 4, GSP versus Pete Spratt. Back in November 2003, although the UFC was already owned by the Fertittas and ran by Dana White, the organization was still a pretty far cry from the powerhouse it would eventually become. This was before the tough boom got the mass exposure on television and the dark ages were still in full bloom, meaning they didn't sign people to exclusive contracts back then because, well, they couldn't really pay enough to make that happen. So oftentimes fighters were just signed to one-off contracts or short-term ones, and UFC veteran Pete Spratt was no exception to that. And even though he was coming off of a victory over Robbie Lawler with promotion, Spratt basically was free to go fight anywhere he wanted and get an easy payday or tune-up fight for promotions that were willing to pay his going rate at the time. And although it's never been clearly outlined why he did ultimately decide to go up to Canada and fight, it's been widely speculated that this was a high-paying tune-up fight for him, also posited by George St. Pierre himself, as he stated in his autobiography. Unlike Spratt, though, GSP was very new to the sport. He'd only just been competing for about 2 years and was going into only his 5th fight. He did have wins over future names like Ivan Menjivar and Thomas Denny, but they were on the come-up as well, so it likely was seen as a safe bet for Spratt. He, of course, couldn't have been any more wrong. It only took 15 seconds before GSP took him down to the ground, and Spratt would never find his way out of the now famous quicksand-like pressure that would become a hallmark of George's career moving forward. There was a moment of success for Spratt where he was able to turn into GSP's guard, but that proved to be fleeting, as within moments of that, he'd actually take Spratt's back again and finally a rear naked choke as he was trying to stand up. This was the fight the UFC ultimately couldn't ignore anymore. With the name recognition Spratt held at the time, and 2 months later, he debuted in the UFC and never fought anywhere else since. Number 3, Frank Shamrock versus Enson Inoue. I challenge you to find a more grueling fight than this one that also has an insane ending taking place in its closing moments. It happened much, much earlier than any other contest on this list in the year 1997 for Valley Tudo, Japan. Many are familiar with the name Shamrock because of his brother Ken, but don't necessarily know Frank, who was on the verge of embarking on the first true prestige title reign MMA had ever seen since titles were introduced. Enson Inoue's place in history was cemented in his next bout, where he would dethrone the undefeated UFC champion Randy Couture after vacating his title in one of the craziest style clashes of that era, exposing the early holes in amateur wrestling with submissions. But Frank Shamrock was no amateur wrestler. In fact, he was a catch wrestler who was extremely well versed on the ground for that time period and had just recently begun going down the revolutionary path of cross-training disciplines regularly with strikers like Murray Smith and AKA founder Javier Mendez. That proved to be a huge turning point for his career, and really the sport, because of the way that he paved. He'd already been the interim king of Pancrase, but hadn't fully realized his potential yet, leaving the promotion with just 1 win in his last 4 fights. But right around this time, too, is when the training changes started to show. He would earn 2 more wins, and little did he know was about to go into the later self-admitted toughest test of his entire career to that point, giving up 20 pounds to the Shooto light heavyweight champion across the ring from him. As Enson's heavy strikes opened up the fight, Frank Shamrock went straight for the takedown out of instinct. This began a grueling ground affair, forcing both men to use the full extent of their cardio game. And while I wouldn't consider it the most entertaining first round and a half for the average fan, what I do appreciate about it was A, that it was high level at the time, and B, there were no ref stand-ups back then. If you got into a rough situation, you had to find your way out. Nobody was just going to stand you up and save you from that position. And when things got really insane was when both men spent just about 4 minutes grappling, and Frank Shamrock was able to threaten a submission that forced the fight to contend on the feet. What resulted was something anybody could appreciate. It was the wildest, heavy-handed exchanges you'll ever see. The difference proved to be a couple of well-placed shots and then a Muay Thai plum knee that knocked out Enson. and raised ringside, emotions took over for Inson's brother Egan as he quite literally threw a flying knee at Shamrock, spiking his head into the canvas. And with that chaotic turn of events, Shamrock would go on to the UFC next and win the inaugural light heavyweight championship from Olympic gold medalist Kevin Jackson, and never lose the title, vacating it in 1999 after finishing the UFC Hall of Famer Tito Ortiz in one of the best fights in MMA history, period. Number 2, Conor McGregor versus Ivan Buchinger. I don't care how much people hate Conor McGregor these days among the hardcore fan base. I mean, I think we're all tired of the antics he's played out in the last couple of years, myself included. But you do have to set that aside for the objective truths about his career and view it as even-handedly as possible. The fact is, the guy basically predicted his career almost to a T at one point, beating some of the best talents the sport has ever seen in the process. After submitting the submission specialist in 2012, Dave Hill, winning the Cage Warriors featherweight title in the process, Conor McGregor had his sights squarely set on attaining simultaneous champ status. And going into this one, his opponent had a far better resume underneath him. He was 21-2, while Conor was still just 12-2. He was the bigger man with a presumable size and strength advantage. Even now, the guy has 41 fights to his name and 35 wins that show that Buchinger is a sadly overlooked talent in the world of MMA. But Conor couldn't have been more calm in that moment in front of a home crowd in Dublin as the chants rung out from the opening bell. He threw a wild array of kicking techniques and combinations and even a takedown. Later in that same round, the clinic continued, and one shot was all it took to turn Ivan Buchinger's lights out. By now, we all know what would happen next. Within just 4 years, Conor McGregor would gain both divisional UFC titles. And say what you want to about the path he got to those belts and the title shot he got just after the first 2 Diaz fights, the Aldo and Alvarez title wins are his best performances to date, you could argue, who are 2 of the very best the sport has ever had to offer. It's this fight that didn't just foreshadow it, though. It even predicted it. Number 1, Anderson Silva versus Tony Strickland. Part of the reason Anderson Silva's first title reign and fight with Rich Franklin was seen as controversial at the time is many forget that he was only on a mere...
My dream is to help people understand how the universe operates, so that each person can find their own unique purpose within the cosmic plan. My name is Matías Estefano, and my purpose is to remember. Since I was 3, I began to remember past lives before I was born. It's part of my brain.
We out here with the champion in Miami Beach in the 305. That's the USA champion right here. So y'all know here, y'all know nobody. That's the best. Y'all better know who they is. What's that? What's that? Over. First round, second round. First round. First round, knockout. Knockout. UFC, baby. UFC right there, baby. UFC, baby.
I'm just chilling casually at another fight show, and this great competitor by the name of Nate Diaz calls me out.
With this belt, I want to defend it against Jorge Masvidal. Had a good last fight. There ain't no gangsters in this game anymore. So I know my man is gangster, but he ain't no West Coast gangster. That would be a fantastic fight.
We're making the biggest fight of the year, the biggest fight in quite some time, the way they were moving the needle. And it's not because we're most charismatic people or I don't know what. I think it's just because we're going to fight and people know that. It's just going to be 2 guys testing each other's souls to the max. We've both been in those trenches, those fights that are tough, and we pull out with victory. But we know how to dig, and people love to see that. Guys that push through the fucking pain, fatigue. I'm gonna give it my best effort to do what I've already done, and that's go for the off button. You know, I just want to make sure I win this one in impressive fashion.
need trouble.
I used to be at 155 pounds, and Nate was in the division, and he was ranked. So I always kept my eye on him just in case we were gonna ever compete or something, you know. And I had seen his brother too, had fought in shows with me, Strikeforce and Nate Diaz. So I knew the Diaz brothers. I had also fought Gilbert Melendez, and I know they all trained together, you know. Those guys were on top of the sport forever at a long time, you know. Of course, I had my eye on them. I knew about the techniques, how the training, the great gas tanks that they bring into the scrap, you know. You got to be aware of everybody. Once somebody's in the top 10 at my weight class, I'm very aware of them.
Main event, UFC 244 in New York, November 2nd. Nate Diaz and Jorge Masvidal. It's a fight that a lot of people want to see. It seems to me that Nate Diaz in some ways is a more difficult fight than Conor McGregor.
We're comparing them to each other. I thought Nate won both fights. First one was Davey tapped him. The second one it was a decision. I thought he won it as well. I was there live. I felt Nate won the decision.
You respect Nate, right? Because he's been